It says glaring emissions, ignoring population growth as our planet sizzles. Of course, those of us who are on the program today in any form are not among those who are ignoring population growth, but it doesn't get the attention that it needs. And certainly that's an important subject that we can get into, but I want to run through a few things first here and then open it up to a conversation. Last summer, and I have to tell you, during COVID, I haven't gotten much of anywhere other than CVS and COVID, but my wife and I live back east in Pennsylvania. My wife and I did take a road trip up to New England. And during that trip, we spent a little time in Vermont. And this is a photo from that time when we were up there. We didn't take the photo, but I came across it. And if you look toward the top of the picture, you'll see a kind of an uneven line there. And that's actually Mount Mansfield, the highest mountain in Vermont. Now, those of you who live out west will probably think of it as a small hill. It's pretty small compared to the Rockies, but that's the highest mountain in Vermont. And the reason it's so hard to see there, even though we were in the Green Mountain State, everything was gray, was because of western wildfires, thousands of miles away, that turned the landscape gray to the eye in Vermont. This is the kind of impact we're having all the time on this planet. We can see it with our very eyes, and it's happening one way or another everywhere. We are transforming the planet in ways that we never have before as a species, and certainly not for the better. And when you look at carbon emissions from fossil fuels, and this chart there on the left goes back about a little over 100 years to 1900, you can see this very substantial growth in carbon emissions. Where are they coming from? Looking at that pie chart on the right, you'll see the sectors that won't surprise anybody: electricity, agriculture, buildings, transportation, industry, other. But there's something missing from this chart. And it's almost always missing from these charts. And what's missing is people. Here's a few of us right now, in this photo anyway. And of course, those sectors that are impacting us in terms of carbon emissions are impacting us because of people and our consumption habits around the world. And yet somehow the population piece of the climate connection usually gets left out of the conversation. And that is a big problem, because we're leaving out one of the biggest ways in which we could address and meet the climate challenge. When you look at population growth over the last several hundred years and increases in CO2, the lines are virtually identical. Now, if you disaggregate the numbers, you will see, of course, that some of us on the planet have a disproportionate impact in terms of CO2 emissions. There are very high emitters in the high consumption countries and very low emitters in the low consumption countries. But taking it all together, you can see that there's a parallel here. And it's a parallel that doesn't get discussed very much for a variety of reasons. When you look at how we could meet the climate challenge, and there are different calculations and computations, and this one's a pretty good one. There are others, but when you look at the different approaches to reduce CO2, what's captioned here by the good folks at Project Drawdown is family planning and educating girls, which of course in both cases have the impact that we're talking about through reducing population growth. And it's roughly just below reducing food waste by their calculation in terms of the most effective way to reduce CO2 emissions. I do think highly of the Project Drawdown folks, but they go to some considerable lengths, as do so many others, to avoid talking about population growth. And that's unfortunate, because when you talk around things, it's very hard to address things when you won't talk about them. And we wish they would, but they choose not to. Nonetheless, the data here is, I think, interesting, particularly when you compare it to such other important things as electric vehicles or recycling. Addressing population is enormously impactful, or at least it could be. Just to step back a minute, and this is probably old hat to most of you, so I won't dwell on it, it took a very long time for us as a species to have any real impact. For the first, from the period 20 centuries ago up until 1800, we added about 400,000 people a year to the planet on average. Today, we add some 80 million. That's like the equivalent difference between taking a brisk stroll and flying in a jet aircraft in terms of the acceleration. Now, the reason this chart tops out in 2100 isn't because that's necessarily what's going to happen. It's because demographers who study these things generally don't look past 2100, because even looking that far out requires you to make assumptions about how many children your great and even great-great-grandchildren may have. And there's no real data out there, so you really can't go out much farther than several generations. But you can see this is drawn to scale, and you can see that it's the last 200 years when we've seen rapid population growth. There are a lot of ways to depict it. This is one cartoon that shows the fish in the bowl, and the bowl isn't getting any bigger, and the fish is worried, or at least the fish ought to be worried. This is probably my favorite quote on the subject. Don't like to throw a lot of quotes up, but it talks about the modern plague of overpopulation. That's about as strong language as you can imagine. You talk about something as a plague and calling it overpopulation. But the person who wrote this also said it isn't enough just to have knowledge. You have to have consciousness. You have to understand it on more than just a superficial level. The thing I also like about this quote is who wrote these words, and these are the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1966. He understood that overpopulation was a plague, and he didn't mince his words, and neither should we. And by the way, when Dr. King wrote those words, world population was less than half of what it is today. So if it was true then, it's doubly true today. And when we're concerned about maybe being accused of being one thing or another when we talk about overpopulation, you can rest assured that Dr. King was accused of a lot of things as well, as he fought for the rights of people and the rights of the planet. Today, there are many voices, particularly in the global South, who talk about overpopulation. It's very interesting that the subject seems to be more taboo here in the United States than it is, for example, in Africa. This is just one example of a public health leader, a woman in Africa, head of their National Population Council, who doesn't mince words. She refers to it as overpopulation, and she certainly isn't alone in that. And I think it's striking that the places where population is growing the most rapidly are the places where people seem to understand the impact very clearly and feel the need to see it addressed. Climate change, I don't even find the phrase particularly helpful. I think it's maybe better to call it climate chaos, because change is really too soft a word to discuss what's happening around the world. This is part of it. This cartoon says, and now for political and religious reasons, let's pretend none of these are related to overpopulation. Energy, food, environment, water crisis, and of course, climate directly. All of these are related to overpopulation, and yet so many people simply refuse to talk about it directly. So who is responsible for higher greenhouse gas emissions? Well, it isn't bears, not even stuffed bears, that are driving the automotive vehicles and that are doing all the other things, using all of what Mark Twain used to call the modern inconveniences in terms of making a climate impact. If you look, for example, here in the United States, and I'll shift to a broader view of the world in a moment, but when you look at our population growth, and you look at the fact that in 2020, we had 3.6 million births in the United States, according to the Center for Disease Control data, about 37% of births in the United States are unintended. Run the numbers, and you find that in 2020, that was about 1.3 million births. That outweighs net migration to the United States by a factor of 2. It's not to say that migration is an important factor, but we need to realize that what's really driving US population growth, even to this day, is unintended births. And that's an area where we need to have more focus in terms of access to contraception, good sex education, reduction of poverty. All of these things help to reduce unintended births. Access to contraception is key, and I deliberately use this kind of cheesy stock photo here because access to reproductive health care should simply be a matter of routine, and it isn't for so many people. And there are moves now afoot in the United States to restrict it even further. And we're probably going to see a Supreme Court decision in June that's going to dramatically restrict access to abortion. And rest assured, or alarmed is probably a better word, there are leading right-wing voices in this country who think that it isn't just abortion, as bad as that is in terms of a restriction, but they believe that access to certain kinds of contraception should be restricted as well. So we're not out of the woods by any means on these issues these days. One of the fascinating facts about how to address pregnancy is this. If 10,000 American women who are heterosexual, sexually active, and in their childbearing years use no method of contraception, 8,500 will get pregnant in a given year. If they use birth control pills, 900 will get pregnant. But if they decide to use implants like Nexplanon, that number drops from 900 to 5. These new methods, these new technologies, and I call them a technology because that's what they are close to perfect. 5 failures out of 10,000 in a year. Now, that's not necessarily the right method for everyone, and there are many different options, as there should be, but it's extraordinary how effective contraception can be. Now, I do want to pause a moment and note, by the way, implants are more effective than tubal ligations or vasectomies, which I think is kind of surprising. I do want to pause and note that there's been a shameful lack of progress on male contraception. Forgive me for making a bit of an attempt at humor here, but it's a serious matter. The research has been lagging. To their credit, to its credit, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been investing money in male contraceptive research. Frankly, it's not a strong profit center for pharmaceutical companies, so the foundation has been investing in that research. Hopefully, we'll start to see some more significant progress because clearly and certainly men bear a tremendous responsibility here. And speaking on behalf of my gender, we haven't been living up to the high standards that we should. So better methods would help, without any question. Looking forward, the UN does different projections. I would note they don't do predictions. They're scientists. They're looking at data and they're trying to make sense out of the data. And what they found, and they should be coming out with new numbers this spring, but the most recent numbers from several years ago indicate that we'll grow from a little under 8 billion, we'll add another 3 billion or so by the end of the century. That's their medium fertility projection. Now that top line, that blue line, is what would happen if family size everywhere stays the same through 2100 as it is today. No one really expects that to happen. We certainly hope it doesn't, but that's what would happen if it did. The other two lines, those green lines, are what if lines. What if every woman on Earth had 1/2 child more or 1/2 child fewer than the UN projections? It shows that small changes in family size can have an enormous impact. There are some people who think it would be a big problem if our population began to decline slowly at some point, say toward the end of the century or thereabouts. I don't see that as a problem. I think it's a great opportunity to have a less crowded world, and that we could certainly adapt to it. If you think about all the things we've had to adapt to over the last century, a somewhat less crowded world would be an easy thing for us to deal with compared to so many other challenges that we face and have faced and will continue to face. Now, it's often stated that, and there's certainly validity in it as far as it goes, that those of us in high consuming nations, such as the United States, bear a very large responsibility for CO2 emissions, and we do. But what's often not noted is the impact, for example, in Africa, of deforestation, which is a direct result of the rapid population growth in Africa. And in fact, it was reported that if Africa's tropical regions were a country, it would be the second largest emitter of CO2 in the world, which I think comes as a big surprise to a lot of people. Deforestation is a huge issue. The Amazon in South America has now gone from a carbon sink net to a carbon emitter because of deforestation. So there's more at play here than sometimes people know. And there are reasons to focus on population and consumption here in the United States, but the patterns may be different in places in Africa, but they're also still very significant and often get overlooked. Here's another portrayal of that data. If you look at the carbon footprint of tropical deforestation, globally, it approaches that of the US CO2 emissions. So it's an extraordinarily large factor, and it deserves to be attended to. Keep in mind that in terms of the net numbers, virtually all population growth between now and 2100 that's projected could be accounted for by just what's going to happen in Africa. Other places may grow, other places will decline, and there'll be some offsetting, but we can't ignore the challenges in the global south. And we can't ignore the fact that there are so many stories like this one of this family. Young girls being married, having children at a very early age, having no education, having no access to contraception. These are prescriptions for, sadly, for misery and for disaster, not just for them, but for a broad swath of people around the world. When you look at the 10 most climate change threatened countries around the world, and almost all of these countries are in Africa, they're looking at, most of them, very substantial increases in population. An official at the UN once pointed out that if you get up in the morning and there's no food, there's nothing, you have no food for you or your family, you have three choices. One, you can starve. Two, you can go somewhere else. Or three, you can take the food from somebody else. And so these are the kind of challenges that are being faced. And when you look at a country not on this list, but it's an interesting example, Bangladesh, it's a very low-lying country. Much of it is subject to increased flooding. Where are the people in Bangladesh going to go as the floodwaters rise? Where are the people in these countries going to go as climate change threatens their livelihood, as temperatures soar beyond the breaking point? These are the kind of challenges we face all over the world. One of the most important things, in fact, the most important thing we can do to meet this challenge right now today is to make sure that every person who has an unmet need for modern contraception is able to access it. There are 218 million women in low and middle income countries today who do not want to be pregnant, but who face barriers to modern contraception. Those barriers are of all sorts. What's key, however, is that the programs that work in these countries know how to meet these challenges. They know how to break through these barriers. Addressing that unmet need for contraception is job number one. One of the great challenges and barriers to this has been the periodic imposition here in the United States of something called the global gag rule, which you all may be quite familiar with. Every Republican president, I'm sorry to say, since Reagan has imposed it. Every Democratic president, I'm glad to say, since it was instituted by Reagan, subsequent to that by Presidents Clinton, Obama, and Biden, have lifted it. When the global gag rule is put in place, and what it says is that no US funds can go to organizations that provide any kind of counseling or provide support for abortion care. Not with US money, mind you, but with any money from any source. It's a gag rule. When it was imposed by the second President Bush, researchers at Stanford University studied the impact, and they found that it was directly the cause of a near tripling of the abortion rate in these countries. Because what happened was we cut off funding to clinics that refused to stop providing abortion care. In turn, unplanned births went up, unintended pregnancies went up, infant mortality went up, maternal mortality went up, abortion rates went up. It's the dumbest policy you can imagine. Thankfully, the US House has now passed a permanent ban on the gag rule. There's a Senate bill pending. We're waiting to see what kind of action is going to be taken on it. Certainly the legislative process is kind of a huge challenge these days, but we're hopeful that perhaps as soon as next month, a bill will pass the Senate that will permanently ban it. We don't know if it's going to be in the bill or not. We do know that we have majority support in the Senate for this repeal measure. Every Democratic senator except Joe Manchin supports this, and only 2 Republicans, Senators Murkowski and Collins, support it, but that gives us a thin majority. It's just a question of getting it in to the money bill that hopefully is going to be voted on next month. The programs that we support as a country, and we are the largest funder globally of international family, help people all over the poorest places on earth. This is a photo from Pakistan showing a woman health worker there working with an Afghan refugee to provide her with family planning that she wants and needs. So these are desperately needed and critically important programs that can make an enormous difference. In terms of the specific numbers, the United States in 2021 provided a little over $600 million in international family planning, served nearly 30 million women and couples, reduced unintended pregnancies, reduced unplanned births, averted maternal deaths. We're one of about 20 donor nations around the world. We're certainly not alone in this. We do more of it, in part because we're larger than most of the other countries that do it, although countries like Sweden and Norway do more as a proportion to their size. But we're not alone in this fight, but we could do more. And the House bill that I mentioned a minute ago actually increases funding this year by 37%. We're still waiting to see what will happen in the Senate, but we're hoping to see a substantial increase there as well. Cartoon that won't surprise anybody, going back to the first Earth Day, which I remember, 3.7 billion of us. This is a little out of date, but 7 billion on the way to 10 or more. What's going to happen? Well, we've got recycled paper, but there's so much more we need to do that we haven't done yet. Just as I wrap up, I want to answer a question that I often get asked or comes up. How many people can the Earth support? It depends on how we live. For example, and I hate to say it, but this was something that really was on the menu for a while at some of the fast food restaurants, the hamburger, hot dog, potato chip combo. If you're ever going to decide to eat one, I suggest you do it while you're in a hospital emergency rooms, because you're probably going to need their services in a moment. But if people ate not this, but a typical American diet, there would be enough calories produced globally so that 2 billion out of the nearly 8 billion of us would get food and the rest wouldn't. If everyone on Earth ate the diet typical of the Indian subcontinent, there are enough calories produced globally for everybody to have sufficient food. However, distribution is always an enormous issue. On the other hand, if we all wanted to live like the very poorest people in East Africa, struggling to survive as these people are, we could cram 40 billion people on the planet. The number of people that can survive depends very much on how we want to live and how we want others to live. But we know that if we work together, and this is a picture of pre-COVID of mostly young people who came to one of our programs, we can meet these challenges. We know how to meet the population challenge, and it would do a great deal to help meet the climate challenge. And yet so many people simply don't make that connection. So on that note, let me stop and hopefully we can go to questions and a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Yeah, we do have, thank you everyone for submitting questions, excuse me, during this talk. And we also have some pre-submitted questions. I think there may be some overlap. So I'll just start running through them. And obviously if this conversation, these questions spark more questions, just keep adding them in the Q&A and John will get to them. So let's see. So what actions can the US take that will be most impactful to tackle our global population growth? I think you've kind of answered this question, John, but I think addressing it directly might help.
I did, but I would just add the following, that for 4 years, we abandoned our leadership role globally on almost every front. And when we invest more in international family planning, it puts us in an excellent position to turn to other nations, to turn to Japan, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, which is unfortunately cutting its funding for international family planning, and to others and say, we're increasing our support. We want you to do the same. That's what leadership is about. It's very hard to ask others to do more when you're not willing to do it yourself. And when you look at what our investment in international family planning costs, it's about equal to a nickel a week per American. So it's an affordable investment. By the way, I do want to mention now that if there are any questions we don't get to, or if anybody would like to hear from me or have an exchange with me, you can send me an email anytime to John, John, @popconnect.org, and I'll be happy to get back to you personally.
Thanks, John. I just dropped John's email in the chat as well, so people can copy and paste it. But it's Stephanie. Okay, let's see. This is a good one that comes up a lot. So how do we respond to those who say it's not population, it's consumption that matters? And in tandem with that, it's the wealthy countries whose populations are declining that are the cause of global warming. So it's simply wrong and probably racist or classist to be pointing the finger at poor countries whose populations are increasing, but are actually not contributing much to the global CO2 problem.
Well, there's a whole array of issues there. First of all, we don't provide any family planning anywhere unless we're invited to do so by that country. This isn't a question of us pointing fingers at people. It's responding to countries that are less well off economically than we are, who would like our help. And keep in mind, this is self-help too. Most of the funding for these programs comes in country themselves, from countries and their citizens. It's a question of us providing some assistance and some help. So we're responding to requests for aid, not going in and trying to tell other people what to do. Let's keep in mind that we have population issues right here in the United States. Our population isn't growing as rapidly as it once did, but it is still growing rapidly. And keep in mind that more than a third of births in this country are unintended. We should be rethinking our own economy and thinking about how we can have a healthy and successful economy without population growth. That's another way that we could show real leadership. Certainly consumption matters, but consumption takes many different forms. It takes typical consumption that you see in an affluent nation, but when people are desperate for food and desperate for survival, it's no surprise that they cut down forests and turn them into farmland to try to grow crops. And when they do that, because of their need for food, that too contributes to global warming. So consumption itself takes more than one form. And it's not either or. We would never take issue at all with those who see consumption as a vital and critical issue. It's just surprising that some of those who talk about consumption seem unwilling to talk about population.
Absolutely. Sorry. So this is sort of going off that a little bit of then how do we work with politicians and scientists to reshape these conversations, or how are we trying to influence these conversations around population?
I'm particularly glad that the person who asked that question put scientists in there as well, because I'm going to touch on that first and then kind of move to the political side. Based on what we've been able to discern, the majority of our members, in fact, about 80%, seem to have pursued careers that have a quantitative dimension to them. We have a lot of scientists, a lot of academicians, a lot of people in medical fields, a lot of engineers, architects, all sorts of people. And we have a few poets too, but we have a lot of people who think about things quantitatively and kind of get it in that regard. Scientists are among the most respected people in this country. I might add that politicians do not enjoy the same high level of respect. And one of the things that we're going to be doing a great deal around over the next year that was just approved by our board this past weekend is we're dramatically expanding our own outreach efforts. We plan to be reaching out to about 5 million people over the next year to make the case. And we're particularly focused on people who are concerned about science, because I think that's where you can find real leadership in this country. People trust scientists. Not everybody, but a lot of Americans do. And we're going to be focusing a lot of our work on recruiting more scientists. And we also want to engage our own members, all of you, more than we have in the past. We want to find new ways for you to be engaged. And we want you to let us know what you want to do. We're happy to work with you. There's so many ways you can become useful if you want to around this issue. As for politicians, we live in a strange world these days. When something comes up for a vote in Congress, it's pretty much a yes or no proposition. The good news is we have the slimmest of majorities right now in both the House and the Senate who will vote yes on final passage on the things we care about. On the other hand, getting through that process with the filibuster and other issues is very challenging. And I don't have to tell you that we're going to be facing a very challenging election this coming fall. As many of you know, we're actually two organizations. Population Connection does not engage in partisan elective activity, but Population Action Fund does. And certainly anyone who's interested in that can go to that website and find out how to do more and become more involved. Elections really do matter greatly. And these days, it's rare to find any politician who isn't on the federal level, who isn't 100% with us or 100% against us. And it pretty much breaks down with a couple of exceptions on party lines. So that's kind of where we stand these days.
This is sort of in tandem with that. This is now a current question that just popped up during this webinar, is how can Population Connection coordinate with other organizations to amplify and build influence? Because right now everything seems fragmented.
We work every single day with many other organizations. Most of the advocacy and lobbying around these issues comes from a group of about 80 organizations that work around what's called sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice. One of the things that we're going to be focusing our attention on more over the next several years is trying to get more environmentalists and environmental organizations to make the population connection. I have a lot of respect for national environmental organizations. They do great work, but sadly, most of them are AWOL on this issue. They, for various reasons, won't talk about population. And what we want to do is introduce them, for example, to voices from the global South, organizations that we work with in places like Uganda and Kenya and Guatemala and elsewhere, organizations that we try to help and support, and people at those organizations who understand overpopulation is a big problem. And we also want to encourage, in a friendly kind of way, those of you who belong to various environmental organizations to seek to persuade those organizations to take another look at population and to realize how important it is. Again, we don't want to criticize those groups because they do important work, but they're missing most of them on this issue. I would also note that we work very, very closely with many educational groups. We work on many colleges, hundreds of colleges and universities. Those are some of our closest allies. And so there are all kinds of alliances that we're part of. We try to play a very specific and key role in those alliances. On the education side, we're the only national provider of population education. And on the advocacy side, we're the leading grassroots advocates for international family planning. And those are the roles we play. And I note here that we are grateful that the Center for Biological Diversity, with whom we work, is one environmental organization that does step forward on these issues. I wish many of our other colleague organizations would do the same.
Absolutely. And everyone, I just dropped a link to the page on our website that has some of our current partnerships that John just alluded to, of organizations, small organizations that work in the global south, in case you're interested in those. Okay, this is sort of two questions that ask a similar thing, which you already touched on, John, but you could probably go into more detail, is the idea of, this conversation is always framed about population that, we need growth for economic growth, and that for many politicians to be against that is sort of political suicide. So, how can we reframe that topic and introduce framework for sustained economic growth without population growth?
Well, like a lot of things in life, and I think a lot of people, not our members, but a lot of people are uncomfortable with this fact, it can get complicated. On the one hand, if you ask any business, I don't care what business it is, for-profit business, what they want, if they're selling something, is they say they want more customers. Now, we know the problem with that. Depending on what you're selling, that can have all kinds of issues with consumption. Frankly, the more we can get people to become consumers of ideas rather than things, the better off we're all going to be. And education is a great example of that. It's a form of consumption that we want to encourage. We want to encourage people to consume more ideas, to read more books, to participate more in the life of the mind, because that's the kind of consumption that we all benefit from. But the fact is that having more people does not make for a healthier economy. Let's take the issues that often gets raised. What is going to happen, for example, in the United States or any country, if you have fewer children? Well, it turns out that yes, indeed, there is a significant amount of social spending on those who are older. But young people are very expensive too. Taking care of them and educating them properly is a very expensive proposition. You can offset those costs. As population slows, you may need more life care communities, but fewer elementary schools. You may need more gerontologists, but fewer pediatricians. And as for the oft-raised point about Social Security, if you simply eliminated the income cap, earnings cap on Social Security, and I think it would only be fair and reasonable that everybody who makes earned income pay the same rate, the Social Security funding gap would virtually disappear. So we can meet those challenges. When you think of the challenges the world faces, whether it's climate change, whether it's the rise of authoritarianism, whether it's issues around food and water, dealing with a slower growth in population, hopefully population stabilization, hopefully population decline in a healthy and hopefully thriving society, those could all be very positive developments that would help us solve all these other problems and free up resources for other things.
Absolutely. Let's see.
It's always nice to have a member of our staff agree with me. And let it be known, one of the things that I really appreciate about the people who work here is they don't always agree. We don't always agree with each other about everything, and we have some very lively conversations. And so if some of you out there don't agree as well, by all means, I look forward to hearing from you.
That's very true, but I do agree with you, John, on these points. Okay, let's see. So I'm trying to thread these questions together in a way where they sort of make sense, one leading into the other. Let's see. So someone's asking a question that came up during the webinar about family planning and sex education here in the US. Would you agree that family planning should include educating high school students about waiting to establish themselves academically and in careers before becoming parents?
Oh, and it absolutely, but it should start much earlier than that. I think you can't start too early. Obviously, it has to be age appropriate. Our education programs, our population education programs start at kindergarten. Now, rest assured, we're not making poor kindergartners suffer through a text on demography. Not that demography texts are difficult, or they are difficult, but they're difficult in a good way. But we're not going to hit a poor 5-year-old with that. But one of the activities we have for 5-year-olds is you put them in a setting where everything's crowded, and they talk about crowding. I have 2 granddaughters, and just today, this morning before work, I was talking to one of those 4 years old about she goes to preschool and how when it gets loud in the room, she doesn't really like it because it's so crowded. I mean, you can have these conversations, an intelligent and thoughtful conversation with a 4-year-old about this. And I do, at least I find it interesting. I hope she does. So you can't start too early. And it's also important to realize that the poverty among children in this country is a major driver of population growth. When people grow up in poverty, they're living in constant stress. And when you live in constant stress, you don't make good decisions. You tend to drop out of school earlier. You tend to get into situations that can be unhelpful. You tend to have children much earlier. When you look at the data, and we look at the data, the age at which a woman in the United States has her first child, if she has any, correlates perfectly with the amount of education she has. Education for women is critical. And so that's a big part of it, as is contraception. So you put these two things together and you create an environment where people are able to grow and live and thrive. It's a prescription for smaller families. Overwhelmingly, when women and couples have choices, they choose smaller families. I see Elaine made a point, and the point is that if you look at to use the numbers, you look at $600 million, a little over $600 million that we invest in international family planning, using keeping the math simple, there are about 330 million Americans. If you round it down to 300, that means that we're investing $2 per year per American in international family planning, 52 weeks in the year, doing a simple rounding, it's a little less than a nickel a week. That's the US investment per American in international family planning. And I can't think of anything we invest in that has a greater yield than that.
John, it popped up, which comes up frequently, discussion about starting to limit the child tax credit. Do you want to address that, since that's a pretty frequent point that's made?
Sure. The poverty rate among children in the United States declined by nearly 50% in the middle of 2021, and it rose again by almost 50% in January. For the second half of last year, there was a program in place that provided essentially income to poor families based upon the number of children they had. Is it possible? It's not just possible, but it's a near certainty that there are some people who would see this additional income and decide to have more children. That's going to happen. You've got a country as big as ours, you can find examples to prove almost anything. But overwhelmingly, what the data shows is that when people have a living wage, their situation improves dramatically. Parents have more time to spend with their children grow up in a more stable environment, they have a more nutritious diet. All of these things tie together, and there've been a lot of experiments, or field testing is probably a better word to use, where they provided subsidies to families and seen dramatic improvements in education attainment as a result of that. So if we can lift children out of poverty, they're going to grow up to be more responsible and more productive adults, and they're going to be adults who make better decisions, and they're going to postpone having children. They're going to have fewer children. Poverty is a vicious cycle. We can break that cycle and have a virtuous cycle instead. Unfortunately, that legislation is now expired. Don't know if we can get it back on track or not.
Okay, and then let's see, this is one question, maybe it'll spark some more. So sort of moving away from the policy side and whatnot, this is one of the questions we do get that's more practical. It was a pre-submitted question. Someone said that during a previous webinar, it was explained that it's not appropriate to ask people to stop having children, obviously. That the right number of children for a woman to have is the number of children she wants to have, that to empower women will naturally bring down the population rate. Would you help give some language guidance to express this member's desire for people to have smaller families without sticking their foot in their mouth? So how can we talk about this, in a way that honors people's, right to choose?
Yeah, as you're raising that question, I'm thinking back to a conversation I had a few months ago with one of our members in Arizona, who said, and this was not an atypical conversation, said that he and his wife had decided not to have children. However, they adopted 2 children. They adopted 2 special needs children, both of whom have gone on to be successful adults with careers of their own. They were able to overcome some of the challenges that they had. And I think stories like that, the more people can speak from some experience of their own and share something positive. Outside of a classroom, most of us don't really enjoy being lectured at, as a general rule. And I think if we can share positive experiences that maybe we've had, maybe people who are child-free, who've been able to devote themselves to a great cause or something, and all causes are great if you devote yourself to them, whether they're on the grand scale or the small scale. I think of a woman, and also happened to be in Arizona, who was an attorney, and she was very concerned, one of our members, because she saw the school was so poor in that community. So she went and started a charter school. She said, I didn't know a darn thing about how to start a charter school, but I was smart and I figured I could figure it out. And now this is a school, 100% of the kids there are on school lunch programs. They're all from poor communities, but these kids are going on to be very successful. So, there are so many positive ways, but I think the more we can speak from a positive experience, that is so much better than, it usually doesn't work to tell other people what to do. My experience is people don't really, if anything, they'll probably do the opposite, just because we're an ornery species. So I think speaking from positive experiences of things we've seen or from our own experience is the best way. And I think that that kind of lived experience means more to people than anything else.
Agreed. All right, we've mostly run through the submitted questions. There were a few, John, I don't know if you want to delve or sort of wade back into the political side of things. There's some sort of scattered questions of, how much are the anti-abortion politics of the Republican Party a roadblock to addressing, climate change linked with population, and how many members of Congress on the Republican Party, are just scared to speak out on this, or are really just in denial. Those are kind of 2 separate questions, but sort of covering that end of it. So I don't know if you just want to.
25 years ago, I've been with the organization for that long now, but 25 years ago, and I've been a member that long too. So greetings, fellow members. There were about 40 Republicans back then, 25 years ago, in the US House who supported family planning, and about 40 Democrats who generally didn't. Today, in the US House, every single Democrat supports family planning and every single Republican opposes it. Let me note that I don't welcome that opposition at all. I wish the 2 parties were competing to see who could do more. If you go back even further, you go back to around the time of our founding, which was 1968. Back then, when there was a young congressman named George Bush from Texas who was the leading spokesperson in the Republican Party and even in the Congress for family planning and for birth control. So there's been this enormous shift within the grand old party over the last 50 years. They've gone from being the leader on this issue to a party which, with a few exceptions, and I do want to note them, in the Senate, again, you have Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who support family planning. But when it comes to Congress, they're it. I don't know what exactly, other people a lot smarter than I am have tried to figure out what's gone wrong with the Republican Party. I'll leave it to them to try to figure it out. I just think that until some Republicans can find ways to win primary elections on a more centrist platform, it's going to be very hard to get the party to shift. And I wish they would. I miss the grand old party, even though I've always been a Democrat personally.
All right. I think we have time for one more question. And this was one that just popped up in the chat of, does the word population make it more difficult to talk about this issue? And might it be useful to have other descriptors such as humankind? And I feel like this is sort of a universal question for us.
Okay, and I saw Tom Cameron asked a question about religion, which I'll touch on as we wrap up. We did some research, last couple of years, and we're going to be doing some more, because when you work at an organization, try as you will, you're surrounded by like-minded people, and you can be an echo chamber if you're not careful. And so we went out and we hired a firm, the Celinda Lake firm, which has done a lot of great survey research. And we went out and we did a survey with environmentalists and with young progressive activists, two different groups, environmentalists of all ages and young progressive activists, to see how they reacted, among other things, to the language with which our mission statement begins, which is overpopulation threatens. Those are the first two words in our mission statement. Overwhelmingly, both of these groups agreed. They agreed. So there's this sort of commonly held view that you can't talk about population. My view is the reason you can't talk about it is because people don't talk about it. And that what you find when you open the conversation, you find people are quite willing to discuss it. I've spoken on 84 college campuses to many thousands of students. Overwhelmingly, they're receptive to the subject. We work with some 3 million school children a year. Overwhelmingly, their teachers are open to the subject. So you can approach it in a very useful way and get people, once you get past those initial concerns, you can have a real conversation. On the religious side, I would just note that religion covers a pretty wide gamut. You have some religious organizations, such as the Catholic hierarchy, that oppose contraception. On the other hand, in the United States, Catholics have smaller families than Protestants. So it gets a little complicated. If you look at Islamic nations, you'll find some of them are very much of a problem when it comes to family planning, but other Islamic nations very much welcome family planning. So it's a pretty complicated picture out there. And I think, again, the more you can speak from your own experiences and kind of share what you've found to be true and useful, you can sometimes get past some of the barriers. That said, we're not in the business of trying to please everybody all the time. That's a hopeless task. We're going to stand up and we're going to talk about overpopulation being a threat, and we're going to continue to do so. Some people will appreciate it, others won't, and that's just the price of admission. So thank you all for your wonderful engagement, your support. John at popconnect.org. I'll be glad to get back to anybody who has something they'd like to raise, and we want to encourage all of you to become more involved.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. So as you've seen in the chat, we will be sending around a link to the recording and some answers to questions in this chat. So hopefully, you'll be able to share this with people. A lot of you expressed, want to share this with others that you know. So thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.